Custom validation rules are nothing new within Laravel, but we now have the opportunity in 5.5 to define out class-based custom validation rules, and this allows us to be a little bit cleaner and use more functionality to build up our rules. Now we're going to take this part to go into a full example, so this is going to be much longer, and for this we're going to use Mailgun's email validation service. So rather than just determine whether an email address has the right syntax to it using the regular expression used within Laravel's default rules, we're going to of course use syntax checks here as well, but also DNS validation and spell checks as well. So let's just take a look at how this works. If I go ahead and type in my email address but get rid of the E, this of course is not a valid domain, so it's going to give us back that we have an invalid email address. And interestingly as well, if for example I was to, I don't know, say a Hotmail email address but leave off the L, what this is also going to do is give us the suggestion here as well. So did you mean alex@hotmail.com? So we're going to build this out and we're going to go through exactly how to build all of this out in this part. So let's go and look at what we can do with this. Okay, so to take a look at the basics of this, I have Guzzle installed because we're going to need to make a request to Mailgun's API. If you don't use Mailgun, don't worry, the concept is the same for any third-party services or just any validation rules whatsoever. So of course, if we go ahead and submit this with an invalid email address, we see Laravel's standard validation rule kick in, and this is over in the auth controller just here over in, or the auth section over in the register controller. So we just have a standard list of rules. Now we've always been able to pass in a custom rule in here in terms of using something like rule exists, and I'll show you how that looks, but we're going to pass our own class in here. So really the first thing to do is just define this class out. If you're not sure how to normally create custom validation rules, all that information is over on the Laravel documentation. What we're going to do is not add this to a service provider, we're going to build this up. So what I technically do is put this inside of HTTP, since that's the kind of layer that we're dealing with, and we could maybe create a validation folder or a rules folder, you know, whatever you wanted to do. So in here, let's create a class out, and I'm going to call this valid email. Makes a little bit more sense to give it a name like that. And let's go ahead and create this class out and see what we can do. So valid email, and let's bring the namespace in for this. So there are typically two methods that we want to define here for this. The first one is passes. This will of course determine whether it has passed given the attribute that we're dealing with and the actual value. So what we're going to do for now is just go ahead and return false in here, so we know that this always fails. Now the other thing is really great, we can actually define out the custom message in here within a method. So this gives us the opportunity to switch this message around if we need to, and we are going to be doing that based on the results back from Mailgun. So I'm just going to say failed in here just so we can see how this works. Now before we go any further, we need to make sure that this implements Laravel's rule contract. So let's go ahead and pull the namespace in for this just here, and that's pretty much the basics of our custom rule class. Now over in our validator just here, what we now want to do is include this, but now inside of an array. Now unfortunately what we can't do is use this entire string in an array, because this is just one item now, and that's going to be seen as an entire rule in itself. So what you do have to do is just go ahead and separate out, rather than using a pipe, separate each of these strings as an array item. So once we've done that, we'll be in a position to go ahead and use our new valid email rule. And because this is a class, we can go ahead and pass in any dependencies here that we're going to find useful. So let's bring the namespace in for this just at the top here, and we'll come back over here and give this a refresh. Of course, we need to go down here and just add in our comma on the end of there, and we end up with the following. So when I go ahead and register now, we do get that traditional email kick in, that email rule here. But if we were to get rid of this and we go ahead and refresh, you'll see that we get failed. So that's the rule kicking in. Now this is as easy now as just going ahead and determine what you want to do with the value. So you can add, you know, pretty much anything in here that you want, extract out any more complex checks to different methods down here, protected methods, and pretty much do what you want. But what we're now going to do is look at using the Mailgun API service to validate this and switch over this message based on what we get. So the first thing we want to do, because we want to eventually change this, let's go ahead and create a protected property at the top, which we can switch over later on. So I'm going to say in here, sorry, invalid email address, like so. And from the message, we're now just going to return this message. So that's going to work in exactly the same way. If we go ahead and click register now, we see that message in there. So that's pretty straightforward. Now, in terms of the request to the API, like I said, this means that what we can now do is potentially extract things out to other methods. It makes things a lot tidier. So maybe we wanted to implement a method called getMailgunResponse, and then we wanted to pass in the email address in here and implement a method down here to go ahead and actually make that request. Now, of course, into this class, we're going to need to pass in Guzzle. This might be on our container, but what I'm going to do is just new up an instance of this inside of here, but you probably would want to pull that out of your container. So let's go ahead and pass Mailgun into here, or sorry, Guzzle into here. So let's create a constructor. Of course, because this is a class, we can now accept Guzzle in. So let's go and up the top use Guzzle HTTP client, and I usually alias this as Guzzle so we know what we're type hinting. Let's go ahead and accept Guzzle in just here, and we can call it client or Guzzle, whatever you want to do. And let's go ahead and set this client to client, and go ahead and of course create a protected client property up here. I'm not going to add doc blocks in here, but you can go ahead and do so with your own rules. So now that we've done this, over in our register controller, like I said, you can pull this out of your container. But what I'm going to do is just pass in a Guzzle HTTP client instance and accept this into here. So let's do a die dump here on this client just to see that this is all working. And what we should be able to do is submit this through and see our Guzzle client. Brilliant. Okay, so now that we have that, we just need to make a request, and then we can, first of all, with the response back from Mailgun, check if it's a valid email address in terms of their validation, and then we can switch around that message. So let's go ahead and make a request here with Guzzle, and of course we're going to use this client, and we are going to make a GET request over to this API. So I'll just pull in the endpoint just here, and into this we pass in to the query string both the address and our API key. So the API key here, I already have stored it in my env file, so I'm going to go ahead and pull this in from Mailgun key, but of course that could be in config as well, and you could just as easily use the config helper if you wanted to. So for the address then, let's go ahead and pass the address in, and we'll probably accept this into here so we can go ahead and get that. And of course you can pretty much do whatever you want, and that should be pretty much it to see what we have. So let's do a die dump, and we'll JSON decode the response we get back. So we use request get body to do this, and let's go ahead and just submit this through and see what we get. So we get a response back here. The email address, of course, is not valid, and we see is valid false. And we also see this did you mean section here. So we'll explore that in just a little bit. So what we can now do is, of course, go ahead and return this response that we get like so. And then up here, we can, of course, just return response is valid, and that will go ahead and use that third-party API to validate that email address. So if I go ahead and refresh now and enter A, click register, we should see, sorry, invalid email address. Of course, this is a bit slower because we're hitting an external API, but if you do need to do that for any kind of validation rule, then you're always going to see some kind of delay. Okay, so now that we've done this, we know that that works. But what if we want to check that did you mean? Well, it's just as easy now to go ahead and check this. So we could just say if from the response we get that did you mean value back, which will be a default of null, then we're going to go ahead and set the message to something else. So what I'm going to do is, again, extract this out to another method so it's a little bit tidier. So we're going to say something like build suggestion error, and we're going to pass through the response so we can extract out that suggestion. So down here, let's go ahead and implement the method build suggestion error, and into this we will receive in a response, and we can pretty much just go ahead and return what we would like to see. So let's return a string in here. What we want to do is use the original message. So as we have that as a property, we can just go ahead and do that. And then we just want to say, did you mean? And then using the response, go ahead and grab did you mean with a question mark, and we're pretty much done. So we, of course, check that, set the message, and then go ahead and return false still to check that that was falsy. So of course, now what I can do is go ahead and just enter, say, an invalid domain in here, and we'll see, sorry, invalid email address. And as we saw from the introduction, if we go ahead and type in, say, Alex at Hotmail, but just miss off the L, it will say, sorry, invalid email address. Did you mean alex@hotmail.com? So really simple example here, but you could go ahead and use this for, pretty much any third-party service that you need to hit in order to check validation rules. And this was something that we could do before with Laravel, but now that we have these class-based custom validation rules, it makes it just that little bit easier to separate things out and create a really nice clean class where we can inject the dependencies in that we need in order to do this. So there we go. I'll leave the code for this in the course downloads as well, so you can go ahead and check that out if you want to.